federal government provides 43% on just capital investments, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But overall, the states are hugely responsible for funding the system. The user fees that support those investments are stagnant and declining. If you look at fuel efficiency of our vehicle fleet that's out on our highway system, you know that fuel efficiency is increasing, and there's an increased use of alternative fuel vehicles, and what that means is there's less motor fuel tax receipts coming in to governments to fund these improvements. So we've got that decreasing or stagnant resource problem, and then on the other side, on the flip side of this, the cost of construction is increasing with inflation, obviously. You know, the materials, the labor that goes into fixing our system, those costs are rising. So states need to be able to consider all available alternatives, including pay-as-you-go funding, bonding, whether it be general obligation bonds or revenue-supported debt. Revenue-supported debt would be paid back through either the motor fuel taxes or tolling. And then also the U.S. Department of Transportation has loans. There's a lot of talk nowadays about public-private partnerships. That is not a new funding source, but it is a new financing mechanism to pay for these improvements. As I talk about this, I'm talking about pay-as-you-go versus pay-as-you-use or debt financing. Pay-as-you-go means that you're paying for improvements by using your current revenues. If I make $10 this year off of motor fuel taxes, then that $10 is what I've got to invest in the system. Pay-as-you-use is debt financing, and there is some theory behind pay-as-you-use in that the people that are going to be using the asset will pay for it over its life while they're using the asset, and so that's the theory behind debt financing. And pay-as-you-use also can be done through general obligation debt, which is full faith and credit debt of a government, supported by all the taxes that government can generate. Revenue debt, revenue bonds, is supported by a specific revenue stream, so it's not all of the taxes or all of the sources available to a government, but a very specific source. And we have public-private partnerships, and those can be paid for through what's called an availability payment, where the government is paying some contractor to give them access to a facility and have that facility available. And then there's US DOT financing mechanisms that are available, that are used to some extent by some states. In terms of states that use debt financing, we've got 27 states that use general obligation debt to fund their highway system. And another 25 states, there might be some crossover between the 27 and 25. 25 states use that revenue-supported debt. 86% of the states responding to a Transportation Research Board survey indicated that they had debt outstanding for highway purposes, and that was 42 states, so there were 8 states that hadn't responded to that survey, but that's still to show you the breadth and the amount of debt financing that states use to fund their highway system. 95% of responding states indicated that they had the authority within their state laws to issue debt for highway purposes. 26 states have differing levels of public-private partnership authority. That's an evolving thing here in the United States. It's been heavily used in other countries. Canada has used public-private partnerships extensively, mostly for vertical infrastructure, which means buildings. Australia has used a lot of public-private partnership funding, and in Europe they've done a lot of P3 financing for projects. It's relatively new in the states. States that have heavily used it include states like Virginia, Florida, Texas, and Indiana. There are only 4 states, based on the report that I looked at, that do not report using debt for highway purposes. So that's the background and why I wanted to pursue this topic. The theories that I'm going to use to support the work, that the analysis that I'm going to do, I'm going to be looking at the median voter model And this model was developed by Black and Downs, as you can see, mid-century of the last century. And essentially what they're saying through this median voter model is that government decisions are driven by what the median voter would want in that jurisdiction. So the preferences of the median voter will help decide what decisions the government makes. And so the idea is to include variables that represent the median voter. So we'll look at things like age, average income, the poverty rate. When I go through my variables, I'll point out which ones represent the preferences of the median voter. Complementing that is the Ricardo-Barrow equivalency theorem. And when I had to dig in and figure this one out, it was pretty interesting because it originated in the early 19th century with an economist, and he was looking at how Great Britain funded their war efforts at the time, and he was trying to find if there was a difference between using taxes or your current funding versus using debt to pay for this war effort, and what impact that might have on wealth, private consumption as well. And then fast forward to 1974, Barrow concluded that the mix of debt and taxes for a given amount of public expenditure, and I hate reading slides, but I'm going to read this one, would not have an effect on private wealth. So essentially what they said is that they came to the same conclusion. Barrow did not specifically reference the Ricardo work when he did his study. So they essentially came to the same conclusion that the choice between whether you pay for something using debt or if you pay for it using taxes will not impact consumption by citizens. The idea is that if you use debt to finance something, then the citizens are going to know that that could be future tax increases, so they're not going to spend that money, they're going to save it. So I looked at the research out there around my question about the determinants of whether or not a state is using debt financing, and if so, to what extent. And I found a piece by researchers Wang, Hu, and Duncombe from 2007 that I'm using as my foundation research piece. And I'm highlighting on this slides the differences between what they did and what I'm going to be doing, so you can kind of see where I might be adding some things that they might not have considered, and why we're going to update what they did. So they looked at the financing decision for all capital projects, so they weren't focused just on transportation or just on highways. They were looking across the government and looking at if they're building prisons, schools, universities, things like that. So they wanted to see what the financing decision was for all capital projects. And they were trying to figure out what the determinants were of pay-as-you-go funding. I'm flipping that over because I'm going to look at the determinants of pay-as-you-use or debt financing, and I'll explain that when I get to my variables. But they used a panel data set from 1988 to 2003, so they used 16 years of data, so I thought it was important to use panel data also from 2000 to 2015. There are some empirical issues as to why I'm using a panel data set, and I chose that time period not only to replicate the 16 years that the Wang piece did, but also because I wanted to capture the effects of two different economic downturns. You'll see there's some economic variables that I've included in my model, so I wanted to see what the impact is of those two economic downturns. And then also what I thought was really important, and one of the things that is of greatest interest to me, is because of fuel efficiency standards in our vehicles and the federal government regulations regarding fuel efficiency standards, which will require that our fuel efficiency more than double by 2026. That means we're going to see a much more rapid decrease or a much more rapid erosion of the motor fuel tax base. And we saw that really emerging from probably around 2010 going forward. So using the 2000 to 2015 time period will help me capture that to see if that's played a role in the state's decisions on how they pay for their highway improvements. The Wang piece used the median voter model, and I'm also going to use the median voter model, but I'm going to add some variables on top of what they did. I will use their variables for the most part, but then there are some variables that I think are important that I want to add to see if they also have some sort of impact. They generally found that the use of pay-as-you-go funding for overall capital needs is affected by the state's income level, the economic conditions of the state, the presence of a divided government. In other words, the legislature and the governor's office were controlled by two different parties. And then certain budgetary institutions they found had a specific impact. Like them, I'm going to include the demographic, socioeconomic, political, and institutional variables. I'm also going to add variables related to debt price and debt capacity. Another researcher, Judy Temple, back in 1994, she looked at the decision to use debt financing for overall capital, and she included those variables, and they both came out as having statistical significance, so I think it's important that we also take a look at that. And then adding variables to control for funds that are needed to match federal capital dollars. So the states are receiving a certain level of funding from the federal government, and I want to see how much of their current revenues, the percentage of their current revenues that are needed to match those federal dollars, because they're getting, like I said, on average, overall, 43% of that funding for capital improvements is coming from the federal government, so they're going to want to maximize those federal dollars. I want to see whether the amount of their revenues that the percent of their revenues that they need to match those dollars will be impacted or will be come into play when they decide whether or not they want to issue debt and insert that debt service payment for a long period of time, whether the amount of federal funding, the amount of match needed for federal funding has an impact. Also going to add measures for voter demand of infrastructure. The other study, the Wang study, looked mostly at socioeconomic variables. I want to throw in a variable for the percent of the state's employment that's involved in transportation-based businesses. It's called Transportation, Trade, and Utilities with the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so we'll be looking at that. And then I also wanted to add the resource constraint variable to see whether or not declining revenues have an impact on the decision on whether or not to use debt. So going into the model, this is how how we put the model together, where the annual budget decision on funding highway capital improvements for the state I and year T is a function of a vector of variables, one being the median voter variables, one being economic cycle variables, the price of debt and debt capacity, and I'll talk about how we operationalize those things, variables representing the political environment and budgetary institutions, and finally a variable that represents that resource constraint that I talk about. And this is a pictorial representation of that model, so you can see I'm going to look specifically at geodebt financing and what impact those different variables or vectors of variables have on that decision, and which of those are statistically significant, and what does that say about how states are making those decisions. This is my dependent variable, so I am going to look at the annual debt financing for highways as a percent of total annual state level highway expenditures. This information is available from the Federal Highway Administration. They do an annual highway statistics publication where they collect all this data from the states and then they make it available. Both of these figures would come from that, and then I would calculate the dependent variable for each state in those in that 16-year time frame. The data sets go back to 1943, so that time period is not, my 2000 to 2015 is not going to be an issue. When I get into the independent variables, this is where I talked about the median voter model and how I'm going to base a lot of what I'm looking at on that model, as Wang did in their study. And so on this, you will see anything that I've marked with a W was what is a variable that was used by Wang and company back in the 2007 study. And I noted whether or not they found it was significant, and I also noted the direction. Remember that they were looking at the decision to use pay-as-you-go versus pay-as-you-use. So when it says positive for per capita income, in other words, as income goes up, pay-as-you-go goes up. So my model is I'm looking at pay-as-you-use or debt financing, so it would have an inverse relationship. So I would expect that when I run my model, I would have, it would come out negative and hopefully also significant to say whether or not it supports what they found. They use percent of income from capital gains, and that is important because you're looking at higher income taxpayers, and they refer to a tax arbitrage theory, which says that as your income goes up, you're going to want to pay for things with current taxes because you're able to write things off of your current taxes. And as you have lower incomes, you're going to want to pay things through debt financing because you're going to want to try to minimize that current tax burden. I looked at, they included population, or the percent of population that are college age, 18 to 24 years old, and they found a positive but not significant impact of that, and so they discounted that as not important. But they did find that the percent of population that was elderly was statistically significant, and it suggested that as the population ages, they prefer debt financing because they want to shove out that need to pay for that to the people that are going to use it. They may not be here to use it. So, population mobility rate, again, that's whether or not you're going to be around to use it. So they found that was not really significant based on the measure of population mobility that they used. And then poverty rate. Poverty rate in terms of what they were looking at for overall capital spending means that you're spending more on those social programs, so you will not necessarily want to use as much as your pay-as-you-go for your capital improvements because you're using the money for those social programs like Medicaid. And then what I want to add is median voter demand variables. They did use a vehicle mile, or they used the number of miles of highways in the state, which I don't think is representative of the median voter. I think that's just a representation of what the state looks like. I want to use the actual vehicle miles traveled per capita to look at this and to see whether or not that demand for more highway money is driven by vehicle miles traveled and therefore having an impact on the decision of whether to pay as you go or use debt. Again, as I talked about earlier, using the share of employment in the trade, transportation, and utility sector of the economy. And then also looking at the highway condition rating. Every highway is rated for condition. So the assumption is as your highway condition gets worse, you're going to be more likely to issue debt because you've got a bigger burden to bear. And the reason I threw that in there is one of the things we found in Illinois, and this is very anecdotal, when less than 80% of our highways were in fair or better condition, we found that that was more often than not when the legislature voted to do a capital bill to fund highway improvements. So just want to see if that plays out across the states. And then I'm going to include a regional variable for weather. Obviously, states in the northern tier have more freeze-thaw cycles, which have an impact on road conditions. So, am I running late? Sorry. Anyway, regional variable for weather will capture that. I'm going to do the economic cycle, where we're going to look at gross state product and changes in employment. Wang found that it was statistically significant that the economic cycle did have an impact on the decision of pay-as-you-go. So conversely, it should have an impact on the decision for debt financing. And then looking at debt price and capacity, the general obligation bond ratings, the two variables there, we're going to fill in for debt price. AAA rated states pay a lower amount for debt service in terms of interest costs, and people that don't have a general obligation bond rating don't issue debt. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. And then also capacity, the capacity to issue debt. So most states have a cap on what kind of debt can be issued. And by including a variable here, we'll see whether or not states that are bumping up against their cap, it impacts their decision. And then finally, as I talked about, the percent of revenues to match federal funds. On the political side, going to replicate the variables that Wang used with the gubernatorial election year, divided government, and then Democratic majorities in the Senate and the House. The only thing that they came up with that was significant was the divided government variable, so it'll be interesting to see whether or not that plays through. And then the budgetary institutions, there's a series of budgetary institutions that they included regarding balanced budget requirements, tax and expenditure limits, and whether debt requires referenda or a supermajority, or whether there's an all-out prohibition on debt issuance. Most of those variables they did not find did not come out statistically significant. The one that was whether or not the governor had a line item veto. And then finally, I'm going to throw in the resource constraints. I'm going to hypothesize that as the motor fuel tax receipts, if the state has a decreasing trend of motor fuel tax receipts, that they will be more likely or less likely, I gotta rethink this one, to issue debt to pay for their highway improvements. I gotta think about that one. So my empirical model, as I mentioned, I'm going to use a panel data set for the 50 states in the District of Columbia for 2000 to 2015. The value of using a panel data set is that it will allow me to run a fixed effects estimation, and the fixed effects estimation allows me to control for the impact of omitted variables. So on my equation, there might be other factors across the states or within the states that could be impacting that decision that I haven't captured in how I've specified it. And so by using the fixed effects estimation model, or the fixed effects estimation approach, I will be able to control for those potentially omitted variables, and that will include time effects and state-specific effects. Again, those potentially omitted variables are omitted because they may not have been observed, so that controls for those unobserved variables. And then I'm going to look at using a two-stage least squares regression to test the hypotheses. It solves for the potential endogeneity between the independent and dependent variable, and that just means that the decision, or they're both jointly decided. So for example, in the work that I'm doing, debt capacity and highway debt financing may be jointly determined. So whether you're going to increase your debt for the use of highways is going to impact your debt capacity, and that's going to happen at the same time. So by doing the two-stage least square approach, you're able to develop an instrumental variable that controls for that. And I cite here two studies that used either two-stage least squares or both of those studies use two-stage least squares to address those same types of issues. And then I want to close with what I see as my challenges going forward once I defend my proposal, which hopefully I will do in 2 weeks or so. So I believe that there will probably be some challenges with the data. There are several different data sources I'm relying on. The bulk of it's coming from the Federal Highway Administration, but in replicating the Wang work, they got data from the Book of States, Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and then they calculated some of their variables, and so I'm going to have to see if that data is available for me to replicate that. So there may be some adjustments as I go through. The other thing is making sure that the data I'm getting is reliable and is valid. So I'll have to do some work around that just to make sure I'm doing it correctly. And then just compiling the data set from a number of different sources, making sure everything lines up the way it's supposed to. In terms of the empirical model, I know that I need to strengthen my understanding on the methods that I talked about here with the fixed effects model and with the two-stage least square estimation approach. I'm fortunate that I have a dissertation chair that's an expert in this area, so she's been very helpful in helping me work through that. And then I'm also going to have to run the models and interpret the results. I don't see that as, once I get through getting the better understanding, I don't see that as big of an issue. But it is certainly something to consider as I develop my timeline, as we talked about. And then time challenges. I have my own business right now. I've been consulting for 4 years. I provide consulting services to public sector organizations and also to private sector transportation system owners, in other words, a railroad. And I need to balance the time commitment of getting this dissertation done with running a business and also having fun with a bunch of grandkids that I have. And then what I want to do as I go forward from this point, because I've had this challenge in the past, but I think this time I'm ready to get beyond it, and so I'm going to treat my research like a client, and I'm going to schedule time for it, and I'm going to do it. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions, talk about it, any feedback, and thank you.
If I understand your dependent variable, it was a ratio of the amount that was funding transportation, service of debt divided by the total.
Right, so every year there's X amount of dollars each state spends on their highways. FHWA, Federal Highway, collects that information, and then they also collect the information of that total, how much did you pay for with bonds. And so it's going to be the percent of new bonds of that total.
Well, it's the amount you committed to debt, not the amount you spent on servicing debt.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That was what I wasn't clear about.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Good question. Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation. It's been very helpful for me. Now, I think you're talking about the bond piece, not the old piece of pay-as-you-go. So this might really address a pay-as-you-go thing, but it's just interesting because you emphasize that the motor fuel tax receipts is such a big issue because they're declining. I wonder if some states, like Illinois, and maybe it's not an issue in motor fuel tax, is there a factor where some states will sweep those funds and use them for other purposes? So even though mathematically it's there, it gets used elsewhere, so it's a little misleading. And I don't think it applies to your debt, but I'm just trying to understand.
Right, so I'm not focusing just on the motor fuel taxes. I'm going to look at what current revenues they're using, because some states don't use motor fuel taxes. Some states just use general funds.
So it's whatever they use, not what's available.
Right, right. And I just used the motor fuel tax because the majority of states use motor fuel taxes,
Right.
if not for all of their funding, at least for a big portion of it.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
I'm curious, it may be captured in a couple of the variables you have, but states that are more progressive in alternative, things like alternative fuel sources, like Indiana's big about, E85 fuel because they produce most of it. And also things like public transportation, such as light rail. Oregon is obviously big about that. They're willing to give up their roadway to put in a light rail system if they can. How do you propose maybe capturing that? Is that potentially a constraint, or do you think that's a median voter issue, a little bit of both?
I think that it gets captured in the vehicle miles traveled per
Okay.
capita.
Okay.
Because they're using an alternative mode of transportation, so they're not driving on the system, so I'm thinking that that's where that would be captured.
Okay. I just wasn't sure if you thought it was more of a voter issue or if it's actually a governance issue. So is it the government's decision or is it the voters' decision?
No, I
to
would
really
see
push
it
that?
kind of as a combination, because then on the political variables, if we're looking at Democratic control of the House and the Senate, and then whether or not there's divided government, that should be able to capture the more progressive, whether or not, if you're more progressive, if it has a statistically significant influence on it. That's a great question. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. You have so many independent variables, and I really didn't have time to kind of analyze them. So I would like to ask you if you are using some of them as a control variables, and if you have suspected some of the interactions going on in the models. I know you are already controlling for a state level effect through the fixed effect model, which I think I understand that. So just to know, if all the variable will be just used as a independent, do you have some suspicion about interactions?
Well, I think, actually, that's a really good question, and some of that's going to be driven by once I start running the models and see what the data produce. But some of the discussions I've had with my dissertation chair is that we will develop some dummy variables that will act as controls, both on the fixed effect side, and then also when we're doing the two-stage least square, we might even, as part of that, we're going to be developing some sort of instrumental variable to address any potential indigeneity between, one of the independent variables and the dependent variable. So as we start running the analysis, I think that would be clearer. At least that's my hope.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir, Dr. Mitch. Yes,
I
ma'am.
get that that's important because they're scarce financing sources, but from a practitioner point of view, your network of policy managers you interact with in transportation, it sort of follows up on his question. Are there certain variables that they would find more interesting than others that might actually have a policy impact, or anything that would influence how we do or should finance infrastructure?
I think some of the budgetary institution variables will be of interest. So there are some states that have very strict limitations on debt. And if that comes across as something that's significant and has some sort of impact, it does allow those policymakers to try to address those issues internally. I think from my perspective, the most interesting piece of this will be with what's going on with revenues in terms of being declining, to see whether or not, because I think an argument could be made either way about, well, if my revenues are going down, I'm going to issue debt so I can continue to take care of as much of the system as I can, or conversely, because my revenues are going down, I don't want to lock in a commitment long-term with debt service. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out, because I think that can help drive some decisions.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just want to say I find your topic fascinating, because I'm also doing determinants of another state policy, state income taxation. So I like this. As far as your dependent variable goes, do you think that, or do you see any implications as far as, or any feelings about like financing versus pay-as-you-go? I mean, is any of that going to come out in your research, or are you going to kind of leave that to the side?
No, I'm very interested, particularly because most states, as I showed earlier, you know, if you look at the states that have been surveyed, and 86% of them have debt outstanding for highway purposes, most states probably do issue debt. I just want to see how that happens over time, and I think the research is going to help show what that is. And so it's, for most states, it's a mix of pay-as-you-go and pay-as-you-use, so we can see, you know, when that debt financing increases, if there's something that's driving that. I think that's going to be interesting to see play out.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, could you talk a little bit about how you developed the model in which I was trying to keep up with the annual budget is a function of the median voter, the D equals a function of BECB.
Yes, that big long
PBR.
equation.
Thank you.
I know
How
what
did
you're
you
talking about.
develop that from your foundational research?
So, trying to get back to that slide. There we go. So from the foundation research that I used, the Wang research, that I found that was something I wanted to try to replicate and then build off of. A lot of this came from that foundation piece, and then there were variables of interest that they didn't include that I wanted to include, and one of the things I need to do to, I think, strengthen what I'm doing going forward is to go back and look at research tied to each one of those different variables I'm looking to include to see what other researchers have found. But the foundation pieces really helped me to structure what this would look like.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Very good. Thank you.
I think that's all we have. There's plenty of food back there, so please take some with you or hang out and eat that. And I did want to make one other announcement about the summer dissertation proposal writing elective. Please make sure you, once we're able to register, make sure you take that. It'll be well worth your time. My thinking is if it's been more than a year since you finished your coursework and passed the qualifying exam and you're not defending this semester, you need to take that class. Okay? All right. Thank you.
So scary the last 2 months. I can breathe.
That made me feel good. I don't know how many times I'm going to hear somebody else doing something. Determinants of state policy.
So this is the time that
Does it for him, just
Yeah.
my eyes glass.
I want to see a video.
Benefit to you.
Yeah. Some stuff she's thinking about.
I mean, I didn't know about it.